You know Odysseus, right? The hero of Homer's Odyssey, the clever guy who outsmarted the Cyclops and journeyed for 10 years to get back home to his wife. We think of him as the ultimate Greek hero, a symbol of intelligence, perseverance, and loyalty. But what if I told you that the shining hero of the myth was based on a much darker, more brutal reality? What if the historical Odysseus, if he existed, was less of a hero and more of a ruthless pirate king? Today, we're stripping away the layers of myth to uncover the brutal history behind the legend of Odysseus. Let's start by setting the scene. The world of Odysseus wasn't the marble-columned Greece of Plato and Aristotle. We're talking about the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE. This was a chaotic, violent period known as the Bronze Age collapse. Great empires like the Hittites and the Mycenaeans were crumbling. Trade routes were shattered, cities were burned, and societies fell apart. It was an age of warlords, pirates, and raiders. Survival was the name of the game, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. The heroes in Homer's epics, like Achilles and Agamemnon, weren't noble knights. They were chieftains or basileus, whose power was built on their ability to lead men in raids and bring back plunder. Their entire economic and social system was based on raiding. You didn't build a palace by farming. You built it by sacking your neighbor's town and taking their gold, their bronze, and their people as slaves. This is the world that would have forged a man like Odysseus. So, where does Ithaca, Odysseus's kingdom, fit into this? Geographically, it was on the wild western frontier of the Mycenaean world. It was a rocky, relatively poor island, not a major center of power. Its location, however, was strategic. It sat right along the maritime trade routes that connected Greece to Italy and the wider Mediterranean for a clever and ambitious chieftain. This location wasn't a disadvantage. It was an opportunity. Ithaca was the perfect base for a pirate king. Let's look at the Odyssey itself, but with this historical context in mind. Read between the lines, and the story isn't just a fantasy adventure. It's a surprisingly realistic account of a Bronze Age raider's life. When Odysseus and his men leave Troy, what's the very first thing they do? They don't set a course for home. They sail to Ismarus, the land of the Cicones. And what happens there? Odysseus says it himself. I sacked the city and killed the men. We took their wives and a great deal of plunder. This isn't a heroic detour. It's a pirate raid, plain and simple. This was business as usual for a Mycenaean warlord. The story only treats it as a mistake because his men got greedy, stayed too long, and were attacked by reinforcements. The problem wasn't the raiding itself, but the tactical error. Think about the adventures that follow. The Cyclops Polyphemus, Odysseus and his men enter a stranger's cave, uninvited, and immediately start helping themselves to his cheese and livestock. From the Cyclops' perspective, they're home invaders. His brutal reaction, while monstrous, is a response to a direct provocation. Of course, Odysseus's clever escape is what we celebrate, but the incident begins with an act of brazen theft. Even the magical encounters can be seen through this lens. The sorceress Circe, who turns men into pigs, and the sirens, who lure sailors to their deaths. These fantastical stories might be mythologized versions of real-world dangers faced by seafarers and raiders. Strange lands with unfamiliar customs, hostile locals, treacherous coastlines, and the constant threat of losing your crew to disaster or desertion. A leader like Odysseus had to be ruthless and cunning just to keep his crew in line and his ship afloat. His famous cleverness, what the Greeks called metis, was the most important tool in a raider's toolkit. It wasn't just about solving riddles. It was about deception, trickery, and strategic lying. When Odysseus finally gets back to Ithaca, he doesn't announce his return. He spends a huge portion of the story in disguise, testing everyone's loyalty, gathering information, and plotting his revenge. He lies to his own father, his loyal servants, and even his wife, Penelope. In our modern view, this might seem paranoid or cruel, but in the cutthroat world of the Bronze Age, this was a survival tactic. A chieftain returning after a long absence couldn't just assume his throne was waiting. He had to be sure who his friends and enemies were. One wrong move, and he'd end up dead. And let's talk about the final battle. When Odysseus reveals himself, it's not a heartwarming reunion. It's a bloodbath. He, his son, and two loyal servants slaughter over 100 suitors who have taken over his house. The epic describes the hall filled with gore, bodies piled up like fish caught in a net. And it doesn't stop there. He then turns his attention to the servant girls who had consorted with the suitors. His son, Telemachus, takes 12 of them and hangs them. The description is shockingly brutal. There's no trial, no mercy. This is the cold, hard justice of a warlord re-establishing his dominance. He is purging his house of all disloyalty, making a terrifying example to anyone who would ever challenge his authority again. So, when we piece it all together, the historical figure behind Odysseus looks very different from the Disney version. He was likely a petty king from a backwater island who made his living through piracy and raiding. He was a master of deception, a brilliant strategist, and utterly ruthless when it came to protecting his power and his property. He was a product of his violent, chaotic time. Does this make the Odyssey any less of a masterpiece? Absolutely not. In fact, it makes it even more fascinating. Homer wasn't necessarily trying to create a moral role model. He was capturing the spirit of a bygone era, the age of heroes. To the Greeks listening to this story centuries later, Odysseus's actions, the raiding, the trickery, the violent revenge weren't necessarily flaws. They were proof of his greatness, his strength, and his right to rule. He did what a king had to do to survive and prosper in a brutal world. The genius of the Odyssey is that it takes this raw, violent reality of the Bronze Age chieftain and wraps it in a timeless story of adventure, perseverance, and the deep human longing for home. It transforms a pirate king into a universal hero. The myth smooths over the rough edges, turning brutal raids into exciting adventures and cold-blooded massacres into righteous justice. So the next time you read the Odyssey or watch a movie about Odysseus, remember the ghost lurking behind the hero. Remember the ruthless warlord, the cunning pirate, the man forged in the fires of the Bronze Age collapse. The real Odysseus may not be the hero we want, but he might just be the hero that his time demanded. The story isn't just a myth. It's a window into a lost and savage world, and the kind of man it took to conquer it. Thanks so much for watching. What are your thoughts on the real Odysseus? Let me know down in the comments. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history behind our greatest myths.